listen, I'm like talking about this book here, and I have to have you sign it too.
Oh yeah,
if you don't mind. At the end, right? Okay. So first of all, I have to thank Kathleen, who's in the off screen right now, who is the owner and founder of where we're at right now, which is Tandem Coffee, Maine. Right? This is what momhood is about. Like, I called this mom and said, can I come film this thing at your shop, and you don't know who I am, and with another mom? Is that like a cool thing? And not only is she saying hell yeah, but she's been nothing but super kind and accommodating and just so lovely. And she's a rad ass mom in her own right. So stay tuned. We're gonna have a little after hours with her later, which is coming. So without further ado, I am here with Chelsea Conaboy. Am I saying it properly? The author, the creator of this amazing book, Mother Brain. And the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is some of the things I gleaned through the experience of reading your book. First of all, I was completely empowered. I felt like I gained instant empathy for dads or other non-caring parents in the journey. And I could all of a sudden actually have like a little bit of a turn down to my resentment knob, which can get turned all the way the hell up as a mom, right? And so it just kind of settled that for me, which was really cool and magical.
I love that.
And I also felt super empowered. I mean, I am a educational junkie, and being able to have the full throughput of your masterpiece of how we got here on motherhood to what's really happening and going on, what are we hearing on these narratives, and how does it tie into facts? Also giving us researched examples. Like, I mean, I know no one's ever read a book like this on motherhood before in their life. Truly. It was,
thank you.
It was an honor.
Thank you. I mean, that's exactly what I wanted to do. I wrote this book because it was 100% what I needed, and I also, information is my coping mechanism. It is like how I make sense of the world, and I have a tendency to go deep, and yeah, it's what I needed, and it's really like so rewarding to me to hear that it also helps other people too, because
it's the missing answers to all of the kind of bubbles that are happening in the world around us, whether we're seeing that on the news, whether we're seeing that in politics, whether we're seeing that on social media. There's all these things, and I think so many people are feeling them and they're connecting with them, but they're not understanding the thread that pulls through all of it. And you beautifully sewed this wonderful thread that connected all of these different pieces, and not only just like talked about it, which is out there, but you were deeply researched, and talked to anybody and everybody who's leading in this space. I felt like I was like on the magic school bus, like getting to go to this place and talk to this expert, and like get a ride here and like get these new perspectives, and it was just so enriching.
Thank you for coming along for the ride. I love that.
My joy.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think the way, the science of particularly the maternal brain has been written about for a few years now, but I think there's sometimes this like gee whiz characteristic to how it's talked about of like, oh, isn't this cool? Like your brain changes, and I really, with this book, like wanted to go much deeper than that, but also wanted to say exactly what you just said, that like actually this story changes everything. Like it should change how we talk about what it means to become a parent. It should change our clinical care. It should change our social policy. It should change, our sense of like fathers and other parents. And I think it's big. And you saw that too.
Oh, I 100% saw it and felt it, and like everybody's super lucky today because we're gonna like do a high level ride through of the book, because the biggest thing I hope we can leave anybody that sees this and anybody that we share this with is that mommy brain, and you gave a little kick to this in chapter 7. This book isn't about mommy brain, okay? This book is not like you're so smart to call it that, because that's the category that we all fall into when we want to learn more about this topic. But it's bigger than that. It's wider than that. And in order for us to, like you said, have systematic change that comes as a result of it, this is the blueprint. This is where we're going. So without further ado, I just had to start off first and foremost just thanking you And I'm so honored to be able to have this.
Well, I'm so appreciative of your interest, and also like it's clear that you have read this closely. If you can like cite what chapter,
Yes,
that is like a huge compliment.
Well, I have to give it credit because the amount of work and effort, like, I mean, can I just ask this and we'll get into it?
Yeah.
What was the process for you to like decompress after the end of this? Like when you were like done, closed.
That's a good question, and I don't think I've ever been asked that.
Good.
I was completely burned out.
You must have been.
I sat on my couch and really like didn't do much for probably 3 months.
Okay.
I mean, so I wrote this book during COVID.
Wow.
I got the book deal in 2019. I did like a ton of research through February. Literally, over February vacation, I was like, okay, I am ready to write. Like, let's go. And then the pandemic hit, and we lost all our childcare. And so my husband and I are both self-employed. We're like scrambling to work and be with our kids, and it was hard.
Oh my gosh.
So, pandemic aside, there were days when I would be researching how a parent's own emotional regulation shapes their child's emotional regulation, and be like crying at my desk because like that morning I had yelled at my kids. So like just this like this intensity of learning what's happening to my brain and how my kids are shaping my brain and I'm shaping theirs while actively doing it was a lot.
Oh, I think you set a really good stage for all of the kind of undercurrent that's really happening for new moms in that first 40 days after the baby comes through. And then one of the things that really inspired me, which is how I kind of came to this aha that I had to launch Rebranding Motherhood, was around this sanitized imagery. I think it's like the 1-2 triple punch. It's like you come out the hospital, you're buried, like there's the physical impact, whatever happened to you with your childbirth experience. Likelihood is it probably wasn't perfect. I think that's a smaller percentage of people than the other way.
Yeah.
Then you're clicking on this pace of 40 days post where everything's changing for you. Your entire brain, like you said, is being remolded. You're turning into a different person, which is like scary as shit because most of us have been locked in to who we've been for a lot of years.
I feel pretty good about that.
Right?
Right?
It's like, oh, okay, I know who I am.
Yes,
No, I don't.
finally,
I
yeah,
mean,
and then no.
what's going on? And then layer that on top of the society we live in, which is so connected to digital and social media.
Yeah.
And there's this myriad of a narrative around the sanitized imagery, telling us what motherhood is, telling us what our postpartum experience is supposed to look like. And none of these things are grounded in truth, accuracy, data, research I learned from your book. None of it. And so for me, what I was so like enthralled in, just because I'm such a history nut, was I used this language of sanitized imagery. But to be able to actually have you walk me through, how did we get here? Not just like 10 years ago, but like hundreds of years ago. How, like, as we talk about generational trauma, how many generations of mothers have had these fucked up visuals of sanitized imagery and how we've gotten here? Can you kind of just high level?
Sure, yeah.
But I
mean, the broad takeaway is that you're right, and it's very deliberate, right? So when I first learned about the neuroscience of the maternal brain specifically, I felt like it was like revelatory for me. It like helped me to totally see my new motherhood in a different light and to see like my whole mothering journey differently. It gave me a lot of strength. And then I like immediately felt angry also. Like why didn't I know this already? And the more I thought about that question, the more I felt like, oh well, it's because we have this other story that dominates, that is about a woman's innate hardwired capacity for caregiving, the maternal instinct story.
Yes.
And I went looking for kind of like the origin story of that narrative. Like, how did we get that? How did we get here, and why is it so strong? and even if like we don't use the words maternal instinct, like we generally, I mean, one of the criticisms that I get all the time online is like, oh, maternal instinct isn't real. Well, have you ever gotten between a mama bear and her cub? Like, we think that this idea that women, that females are innate, automatic caregivers, and that it is like distinct to our sex. We think that that's based in science, and it's not.
Yeah.
It is an idea that came from religious and moral ideas of motherhood that was written into scientific theory in the late 1800s and early 1900s by Charles Darwin and people who followed him. Okay. So what Charles Darwin did was really like tear down the wall between humans and other animals, right?
Yes.
And there were Darwinian feminists who felt like, oh, like this is amazing. It's gonna finally like free us from these narratives of these like Christian narratives that define womanhood and a woman's role. And like we'll actually be able to like ask scientific questions about who we are and answer them. And instead, like those Christian narratives got written into the science. Darwin took down that wall between humans and animals. A lot of scientists had already started looking for instincts in other species, like these like hardwired behaviors that seem to happen automatically.
Yes.
And so now with evolutionary theory, they started looking for instincts in humans as well. And they created these like very long lists, like sometimes quite ridiculous, like instincts for climbing trees, or instincts to be afraid of strange animals, or like they went to an extreme. But some of the founders of psychology were the same men who were like writing instinct theory. And strongest of all instincts they wrote was maternal instinct.
Wow. So they stamped it right there for all of time.
Yes, they said that it was stronger even than fear itself.
Wow.
And
powerful.
William McDougall, who was a very influential psychologist, he was also, much like many of his colleagues, a rabid eugenicist and racist, who also wrote that despite the fact that maternal instinct was so powerful, it wasn't as powerful as a woman's education. And so he said that the more you educated a woman, the less maternal she would be, so therefore we should maintain gender norms and prevent divorce and land ownership and basically keep women in their place. And this was a very deliberately race-motivated ideal, that this was a time when in the United States the white men in power were very afraid of immigration and immigrants having children and threatening white supremacy.
Yes.
And it was like eugenics was sort of all the rage, and this message was very targeted to white women, that it is your duty and your biology to have children, and you are fully capable. There's an essay by a woman who it's so interesting, responding to William McDougall, early psychologist named Leda Hollingworth, basically called him out and said, we see what you're doing here. Like she called this idea of maternal instinct a cheap device.
Ooh.
She said that the same social mechanisms that were used to compel soldiers to go to war were being used to compel women to have more children.
Yes.
And she said that someday this cheap device is going to stop working.
Yes.
And then you're going to have to pay us.
Yes.
And
fast forward.
Exactly.
Like
So
200 years.
right.
Wow.
So we started to these ideas became very ingrained. The sense that this was biology became ingrained in our society and kind of carried forward by like a long line of thinkers, most of them men, most of them white guys, and it sort of became. We called it different things along the way, but it became so ingrained in how we think of parenthood and of motherhood specifically
100%.
that I call it in the book like a classic case of disinformation.
Yes.
Because it's something that actually like feels true in some ways, right?
Yes.
So like, you know, you're changed by motherhood. You feel it. You feel this connection to your child, and you've been told over and over again that this is what it is.
Yes.
That it's your maternal instinct kicking in.
Yes.
Until you believe it without really questioning it.
100%. Indoctrination,
Yeah.
101.
Yes.
You know, and I think what you said is so interesting because it is plausible, right? Like, basics, right? I'm carrying the baby.
Right.
Of course, there has to be
Right.
some nuanced difference
Right.
that I'm connected to this being,
Yeah.
this creature that I've created.
But of course you are. That's
Right?
like that's what the
Yes.
whole book is about,
Yes.
right? Like that you are connected. It's just that connection is not what we've been told it is.
Yes.
It's something different. So
100%.
people often. So I had an excerpt from the book ran in the New York Times in 2022, and it got a huge blowback online. And a lot of people misunderstand often because they only read the headline that what I was saying, they mistook me as saying that like a mother's intuition or like a biological connection to your child is a myth.
Yes.
That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is
Yes.
this idea that it happens automatically, that it is innate, and sort of that it's like this like Lego piece that you just sort of snap
Yes.
onto your brain, and
Yes.
there's your maternal instinct,
Yes.
and that it is distinctly female. Those things are lies.
Yes.
We are connected to our children, deeply connected to our children, but it is a process
Yes.
that comes with great power and great vulnerability, and it is hard won.
Hard one. And I love that because that way of thinking is a detriment to mothers getting the support. One of the things I talk a lot about with my community is the village, okay?
Yeah.
Like, and I use air quotes because there is no
Right.
fucking village. Like, where is this village,
Right.
okay? The synonymous village. But when we continue to believe in these narratives, we're literally holding ourselves back. If we believe that the only person that can do it
Right.
is the mom,
Exactly.
and then we accept that, and then believe in that, and then
Right.
but yet we know we are not getting the right support. We're not getting the right resources. We are getting underpaid.
Right.
We are having this crazy penalty to our career, and
Yeah.
we're really kind of fucking ourselves in
Yeah.
this really twisted loop.
Totally.
And so I think what you're calling out is critical. And I started off saying in the beginning of our conversation, one of the things I gleaned from this was empathy for my partner in
Yeah.
this thing called parenthood.
Right.
Mine happens, I'm in a heterosexual relationship, but like it could be any partner, whoever carries versus not, and us unraveling those narratives and putting in real imagery and real data points,
Yeah.
information
Yeah.
around what is true, I think is going to help people. It's
Right.
going to allow, I have so many mom friends that like are really frustrated by what, the shared load of parenthood at
Sure.
home. However, they still believe in the back of their heads that it's only them that can do it.
Right, and it's so
So,
interesting
you
because
know?
the biology is so linked with the social narratives in
Yes.
the sense when it comes to fathers, especially well all, but when in talking about fathers particularly, like we haven't gotten to this yet, but so in the maternal brain, we talked about how there are kind of two things that change the maternal brain. One is hormones.
Yes.
And the other is experience, exposure, practice caring for your child, of trying to meet their needs and making mistakes and doing it again over and over again. In fathers and other non-gestational parents, it's the same factors at play.
Mhm.
They experience pretty dramatic hormonal changes as fatherhood approaches, and they need exposure. That the more time they spend directly responsible for their babies, studies have shown, the more dramatic the brain changes are for them.
So I love this point and this threading because I think it's so interesting that the point you just made, which was that studies and data shows the more time a father spends with their child, the more their brain is going through this transformative change
Yep.
that we deem is only for mothers.
Right.
And I've noticed in my own relationship, I don't know if you ever experienced this, where like, if I'm doing too much of the mothering, like if it was like a bell curve chart, like when Tina does too much mothering, like the resentment curve starts to spike, and then my husband starts not understanding what's happening. Because children are changing, right? It's not like you can
of
really
course, yes.
like
You
assume,
gotta be in it. You gotta
right?
stay in it.
They're
Yeah.
adjusting,
Yes.
like from an infant to a toddler to a tween, like they're always changing. And so I think it's so important, like, and in those moments, I have to almost pull back and kind of like, I'll I'll take a trip or I'll disappear.
Yeah, right.
So he has to kind of recalibrate and immerse himself in it, because I feel sizable differences in our partnership when he is, I guess, like at even, like an even point with me of like what the hell we're dealing with, like what we're dealing with as far as parenting the kids.
Yes.
So I don't know if you ever.
No, I mean, I think that is exactly it. And it fits into like, well, what do we do with this science? Because if men are told that women are naturally better caregivers, that they don't have the same biology as them, that if they're told that, oh, wait until the toddler years when you can like roughhouse with them, there's really nothing you can do now, then they're not going to do it. No. And if they don't do it, then they are not going to experience the transformation of the paternal brain in the way that we know it can happen. Yes. And that is really foundational, because what's happening in those early days, like I said, is like a learning process. It's what's changing is your social cognition, your ability to understand your child, to understand when you're not meeting their needs, to adjust, to regulate your own emotions in the process, and to grow with them. That is like a super foundational process for parenting. And fathers, given the opportunity, it's not to say that they only can do it when they're infants, but why wouldn't you want to get in on that at the ground level and start that process? And I mean, I just think there are huge implications, not only for what's happening in our households, but society, policy making, and
totally.
And it's one of the things that gives me the most hope about this whole picture is that men are wanting more time with their children. Yes. Like, we know this statistically, they're spending more time with their children, including even like men in power, men of status. They want this experience also. The reality of parenting is that it costs us. Right? Like, we know this, that it costs us, that when you are fully engaged with parenting, you're not able to do other things. Right. It costs us in our physical resources, in our mental resources, in our jobs. There also comes with great gains, right? Yes. But if men can also be engaged as caregivers of babies, they can feel that cost. Yes. They can also feel the gains. They can feel their own change. And then hopefully, this might be like idealistic, they can take those ideas back to their companies, their positions of power in Congress or in the State House, and advocate for policies that support families who are going through those changes.
And I love that. And that's literally one of the mission statements I have in creating rebranding, is that, like, I just felt like there was no place getting a real image of what was being experienced through motherhood. And I was tired of having all these conversations with men where they're like, but I don't understand why we need paid leave. I don't understand why. Well, if you just would do it for 3 months' time, like, you would understand that not only do we need paid leave like 12 years ago, but holy crap, what we're offering isn't even enough.
Exactly.
You know, and it just makes it so innate. And I think that's what's so important around this conversation that you're unlocking. And, by the way, it empowers. I think one of the most beautiful things about being at least in my situation, I'm fortunate, and it is a privilege that I have a partnership. That is a privilege. But one of the benefits that I get from that is seeing this unique expansion that my children get from having somebody else teach them things, having somebody else allow them to experience life through their lens. They're just much richer children. And it's good for all, you know?
And I think so much. So my husband's also very engaged with our kids, and I'm so grateful for that. And you know, that's been a process.
Of course, it's ongoing.
Yes, exactly.
It's ongoing.
And I think so much about, like, if boys are told that women are the natural caregivers, then how are they going to step into that role when it's their turn? Also, if they don't see it, if they don't see men doing it, it's going to be really... This great guy that I interviewed for the book is involved with Maine Voice to Men, which is a daddy boot camp program here in Maine and elsewhere around the country. And now I've read recently, like, it's spreading globally too. And he talked about how he didn't have like a father figure really in his life, a caregiving figure in his life. And he said he went to this daddy boot camp where the fathers who were leading the group bring their babies with them who are 6 months old, and, you know, they're feeding them and taking care of them. And he said it was his first time ever seeing a man change a diaper.
Wow.
So
that's such an intense statement.
Right.
And true for probably so many people.
So many. It's probably the norm. Like,
right? Yes.
And so if you don't see it being done, then how do you do it yourself? And then how do you experience those neurobiological changes? It's like a circle.
It's a loop.
Yeah.
It's a loop.
Yeah.
I love this. We're going to transition into the next set of
Yeah.
questions. Oh my gosh, I'm loving this. Okay, so now I'd love to talk a little bit more around brain changes. So I'm going to read a couple of lines that it's just thoughts that came from your book. So one of them is caring for a baby changes the functional architecture of the brain forever. Not just during the child-rearing years. Remodeling of the parental brain removes load-bearing walls. It tweaks the floor plan. It changes how light enters the space. I would love you to just expand on that because my husband's an architect and for me it was such a poignant example of the type of transformative change that's happening in our motherboard.
Yeah. So one main point of the book is that really new parenthood is a distinct developmental stage, which I wanted to really make the point that this isn't just a little extra bit of activity in these brain regions that just help you get through the sleep loss of those early days, and you're going to go back to who you were before, which is so often part of the storyline. Even in the writing about the maternal brain, it often is but you'll recover your brain matter in this other way. You're
just
not
different.
exactly.
Yeah, it's different.
And we say that a lot, I became a different person. Your brain is changed forever.
Yes.
That is the truth of it.
Yes.
And I mean, so there are these really amazing set of structural brain imaging studies that have found, basically they tracked brain volume across time from before pregnancy to right after pregnancy to a few months out, and that group of researchers has followed mothers to the 2-year mark and to the 6-year mark.
Oh, wow.
And found that many of those brain changes, most of those brain changes, particularly around this social cognition we've been talking about, that they last.
Wow.
And then on the flip side, there are studies that look at these massive data banks of brain imaging in much older adults in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, and they've compared parents and non-parents, and they found that parents' brains are what researchers call younger looking.
Yes.
There seems to be this kind of neuroprotective factor in a broad sense of parenting across a person's lifespan. And so from that 6-year mark to the end of your life, there's a huge gap in the research. We really have nothing there, but there's enough there that researchers really think that these changes last for the long haul, and there's animal literature that backs that up. It also fits with evolutionary theory.
Yeah.
You were talking about the village.
Yes.
So one of the things that made humans the most able to proliferate and become the most
top of the food chain.
Successful primate species in the world. Successful is not the right word, but dominant.
Yes,
primate species in the world. Our success is to be determined, I guess.
Facts.
Is that we started having babies in closer succession.
Okay.
And we were only able to do that because mothers had help from others in raising their children, likely from grandmothers or other helpful adults who were part of their communities. And something that I say a lot is that human mothers have always been really important, and they've never been enough.
Yeah.
So we have relied on these other adults, probably a lot of them who had been mothers themselves, who maintained this functional architecture that's caregiving oriented, and then we're able to use it in connecting with their nieces and nephews, with their neighbors, and with their grandchildren, and increase the chances of those children to thrive and survive.
Which is two things that are bubbling up for me. One, I love that I know the change is permanent. That's one of the things that I've been like low-key having anxiety about. Like, not that I'm talking to many, actually never said it out loud until now. But that this change has been so healing and so transformative. I think when we first met, I said, for me, entering into motherhood was my first touch to enlightenment. What people describe as that. Like, this aha where I see where it all comes together and I get it and I can like travel planes, you know, between time and it comes, and I'm always kind of like, just because of, again, it's these narratives that are pushed out, like, okay, well, what happens when the kids leave? Does it happen? Am I going to lose all this when they go to college? Do I lose it all when they're teenagers and they want nothing to do with me? But it's so empowering to know that I'm going to get to hold on to this growth, to this healing that has come.
Yeah, and going back to that point of like how much we don't know about like what actually parenting means for the psychology of the parent and the neurobiology of the parent and the connection between those things. It's like a big gap in the research, but I love to think about the possibilities. I think a lot of people talk about like spiritual change and what it means for their sense of themselves.
Yes.
I also think a lot about creativity and like
100%.
wonder.
Yes.
And like the sense of Alison Gopnik, who is very famous child development researcher. She writes about children as like the blue sky thinkers of the world, right? Like the R&D of our society.
Yes.
And I love that. And I see it in my kids all the time. And then I think about like, oh, and my brain has been like tuned to like pay really close attention to them. And if I think about it, I can feel that. And so if I'm that close to their wonder, what is that doing for like my creativity and my sense of myself? And yeah, to your point about like holding on to it, I think this is like another place that our narratives around motherhood really do us a disservice. Like the attachment framework, there's a lot of good things in it, but it also sets us up to have this idea of ourselves and our value attached to our children and the outcomes of our children, like who they become and how we have facilitated that.
100%, which is dangerous. It's super dangerous.
On lots of levels, right?
Oh, so many levels, to your point, because one, if I'm so caught up in thinking it's only me that can, rear these other human lives, that's dangerous. And then what happens when they're gone? And then what happens if I've just lost myself the whole way? Like, you just see how you would land in this kind of hole that might feel insurmountable to come out of.
And again, like, deliberate. So, like, John Bowlby, the primary writer of attachment theory, like, he did a lot of good in teaching us what infants need and how to meet those needs and the care that they require. That was really revolutionary in his day. And he like pretty much ignored the needs of mothers or the evolution of mothers through that process. A lot of his ideas were like rooted in it's a whole nother history, but in white supremacy also. So like these are structures that attachment theory is everywhere in our society, and there's a lot of good in it, but we also have to be critical of like how it's how it's shaping the way we think of ourselves and where those ideas come from.
Exactly, where those ideas come from, totally, is so critical, because I think that this word systematic is a buzzword now, and systematic oppression is a buzzword now. I think for people of color, with the Black Lives Matter movement, we know what the hell systematic oppression is. We've known for centuries, generations, as long as we've come to this country. It's been clear. I think now that's created some more awareness for the general human population of, oh wait, there's this thing that's like systematized, where like you can't get out of it and you're locked in it. And I think that's where we're kind of at with motherhood. Like, I feel like we're in this systematic oppression. And moms understand. It's almost like we're in a box and we're trapped, and we know we're fucking in captivity, and like the dude Jigsaw and Saw is gonna come for us and do some fucked up shit, but like only we know. And then we have to come out in the world almost like we live this closeted life that like only we know we like actually live in this box and like perform. And no one else knows.
And not talk to the other mothers.
Exactly. And keep it to ourselves. Like, it's a secret. And it's so detrimental. And I believe that there is such a empowering force. You just talked about it. Your creative expression. We're talking about the gains now. We get a ton of airtime about the fucking losses, but like the gains, right? Like creative expression, deeper empathy, emotional EQ, healing from childhood trauma. Like all these things, we could go this long. Those are the things that are going to set the future leaders of this world. They're going to be the ones that solve the hardest shit. We're going to be the ones that change the world. And like, let's add dads in there too, because guess what? You get those gains too. Dads, others, any other parent combination. But it's not going to happen until we start talking about truth and fact and where these ideas that we are considering fact came from.
100%.
You know?
Yes.
So,
I don't want to like keep talking about the deficits, but when all of what you said is manifest in Black maternal health right now.
100%.
So like it is the perfectly awful intersection of all of the systematic systems of oppression.
100%.
And ongoing, right? That we don't have enough. There are baby steps towards action instead of recognizing it for the crisis that it is. I want to mention in terms of gains though, one thing that I love in the research, and it's literally like a couple of small studies, but it rings true and I want to see more research on it, is the science of how caregivers' brains relate to one another. So there are these small studies that look at like how sometimes it's partners, how their brains respond to images of their own children versus other children in tandem, or sometimes not in tandem, like in a relative sense, like one looking at like how they respond in tandem, like concurrently.
Yes, in parallel. I mean, two different rooms, but like we're getting the same things. How are we reacting?
Exactly. And it's fascinating because there is like some orchestration there. Like they are responding in ways that could be theorized to like help them work as a unit. And then there's also, you know, this kind of like mirroring effect. There's a really fascinating study that looks at unrelated caregivers. So like say I was in a brain scan looking at you interacting with your child in like a healthy way. That would be reflected in my brain as if I was in my own child.
Oh, wow.
So there's this like connection between caregivers where this, I think of it as like it becomes your model potentially for seeing the world. Like you, and it feels, again, it like feels true in how I relate to the other mothers in my life and how I respond to the events of the day on the news. Like how caregiving becomes like a really foundational part of how I see the world. And if more people can do that, or more people can recognize that in themselves, and especially more men can develop that kind of framework, I think that is potentially really powerful.
100%, because one of the things, a realization I've had is I have felt as a Black woman in America many things, but feeling unconditionally and unapologetically accepted upon just entering a space was never the baseline for me until I became a mother. When I became a mother, like I'm getting emotional, but I like feelings. I'm human. I'm human. I have my people in here right now, but this is where I was realizing as the first time in this world as a Black woman, I didn't feel other. I felt like I was instantly part of this community where like, we got it. It doesn't matter what I make, where I live, what I do. You're raising kids? Oh shit, I'm raising kids. We know what we're going through, you know? And we can relate and we can commiserate. And there's this beauty in that. And I think you're right. It's like, what a beautiful place in this world would it be if we could take these learnings of how that's happening in these communities and expand that more broadly. We would be such a more connected humanity if it was possible.
So there's some of the criticism of the books has been like, I do really need to read this book to know that like my brain I become like attuned to my kid, or that like the village matters, or that like fathers are important. And I feel like, I mean, sure, you can know all of those things separately. I the idea that like this is our biology is really powerful. Like this isn't just a political story.
No.
It's not like a nicey nice, like just like makes us feel better story.
Yes.
Like we relate to each other as caregivers because that is how we are made, and it is a character of our species.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That like caregiving this is kind of a reference to one of the original parenting researchers who said this about rats, but caregiving is a basic characteristic of our species.
Yes.
Universally. Yeah.
That is so powerful though, because then you would say, like a lot of the things we don't learn about in school, many things, sex ed, menstruation, like so many topics, that we should be learning about this, and it shouldn't be fucking called home ec.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
Like, can we have some foundational, I mean, education reform has many things that need to go work on. But to your point, what I loved about your book, and I can say to someone who really tried to go through it with a fine-tooth comb to prepare for today, is that this was not a book that was fluffy. This was an educational book on the courses we probably should have had in K through 5, middle school, high school that we never got. And luckily, you were able to condense it into some pages so we could internalize that. And frankly, release some of the weight that has been sitting on our shoulders from these narratives that have been pushed on us. And to thankfully be empowered to advocate for the change that we deserve.
Right.
Because we know now.
Yeah, and I think it really like takes peeling back those narratives to make space for whatever is to come. 100%. Like you talked about sex education in high school. I write in the book about this incredible researcher at Teachers College, Columbia, Aurelie Athan, and she's done, so if you've heard the word matrescence, it's partly because she's the one who has repopularized it in the last decade or so. She also has done a bunch of work in reimagining sex ed, and specifically around pregnancy and parenthood, and talking to kids about teenagers about, do you want to have kids?
Yes.
And how do you want to have kids?
Yes.
And who would you imagine having your kids? And what would be the methods potentially of you having kids? To like start thinking about that these are choices to make, and what will those choices mean for you and your life? Which I don't know about you, but like I felt it was never like a conversation.
No, not on that level. It was kind of like, okay, are the kids gonna go to private school or not? Like, are we gonna have them in school? Are they gonna celebrate Christmas or not? My religion or your? It's like these very surface level decision sets that we're making, which, as you and I both know, don't mean shit if the kid is bleeding in the corner and we're trying to figure out, like, what are we gonna go do? Like, what are we fundamentally gonna do to like raise this kid? You know?
But even like your expectation of whether you would have children, was it in your like family of origin? Was it something that was talked about?
No, not at all. I always knew I wanted to be a mother. Like, I just knew that. I think looking back, because hindsight's always 20/20, it's because of a lot of the childhood trauma I had. I think subconsciously I just felt like that nurturing would be so healing for me and would be so changing. And I just love children. I love that energy, so it worked very nicely. But you're right. I have so many people that I know, mothers, parents, others, who talk about their frustrations in their partnerships with the other person they're raising this child with, whatever their dynamic is. And it's very haphazard. Right? It wasn't like, I mean, it's like things, if they would have had these conversations, would have bubbled up in 10 seconds. Like their frustrations around how their partner's like totally hands off and believes that it's all on you. Like, if you would have had these conversations before, like, how do you guys want to show up as partners? What do you want that to look like? What do you need to accept and not accept from people? You'd be looking out for these traits. You'd be able to assess these things versus so many people are just, I feel like, caught in these situations where they're like, well, I didn't even know I was leaving the hospital in a diaper, let alone that we were going to like talk about what parenting really was. I'm just kind of stuck.
And then layer on top of that we rarely, certainly I didn't know enough to talk about it as like a transformative time.
No.
But, like my husband and I did talk about some of those things, but we kind of thought that we were going to keep being the like competent, generally stable people that we were, like,
right.
you know, in our jobs and in our lives. Like, we were in a good spot. I didn't, like, account for the absolute turmoil that I felt internally.
Yes.
And so if you don't know to talk about that and how to support each other through it, then you're going to feel unprepared.
100% you're going to feel unprepared. What I'd love to talk about in your book that you talked about that I thought was so beautiful is the next part of the book called Motherhood that no one talks about. Grandparenthood. It's like the even smaller black hole box in the arc of what to expect.
Absolutely.
And what I thought was so beautiful is you really talked about how these changes continue on, how they're helpful for you, like the gains can continue. Can you kind of talk to me a little bit about that dynamic and kind of what that means to you?
Right. So, I mean, the caveat here is that, like, we have such a dearth of research, and it's an area that really warrants more. There's been one brain imaging study on grandmothers, including foster grandmothers and, you know, biological grandmothers, and basically found that they have similar responses to their own children, that they're the kind of same sort of social cognition areas line up. I mean, I think it just makes sense, right? Like, it's just like your body doesn't bounce back after you have children. Like, your brain is not going to bounce back to some original form after you're done rearing your children. You're going to keep these tools and hopefully use them. And that is really like a fundamental piece of our understanding of our species right now, that we did use them. I mean, there's a hypothesis called the grandmother hypothesis, which says that, like, helpful grandmothers who lived like a little bit longer by chance, like their genes just helped them live a little bit longer, they stuck around to help their daughters raise their children, increasing the success of their offspring to survive and have children of their own. And those longer living genes got passed forward, and that continued and continued, and that's how we developed menopause. That human life extended beyond reproductive years, and we developed menopause. We are the only species, apart from toothed whales, that has a menopause that we know of.
Wow.
Or not a significant one. Yeah, so
Science.
I mean, it is like a care beyond our own offspring is really like a fundamental piece of what it means to be humans. And I think it is, grandparents aren't always given enough credit, I think, for the role that they play.
100%.
And they're not always invited to step into that role in a way that we need them to.
100%. I think that's what I love too, is almost as a call to action of empowering the grandparents. You had a story in there about a gal who had her children, but then came alive in her grandmother chapter, in her grandmother era, and was getting more active, doing more, all the little things you were talking about, lit back up, creative expression, getting more into the things she loved. And again, as we talked a lot today about privilege and whatnot, it's such a nice benefit. But I think what I hope to see is, for those that don't have their grandparents or their extended family in their life, I don't want you to feel like you're missing out. Obviously, it's amazing to have additional support. But for those that do, understand the power that it can really unlock. So you can give them a little bit more reins, give them a little bit more responsibility. Let the kids have that experience versus where we're kind of oh, grandma's going to mess them up. You know what I mean? Grandma's going to mess them up. No, let that happen because it actually creates more enriched children. It creates more enriched offspring.
I also like to think about this beyond grandparents to just caregivers more broadly. So, for example, I think about professional caregivers who, maybe even those who haven't had pregnancies of their own. Some of them have. One of our favorite daycare teachers ever was a grandmother who was caring for kids later in her life, and professionally, and she was amazing. But even those who haven't had a pregnancy, they've had all this exposure to babies. They've had all of this practice reading their cues and responding to them and trying again, which is something that's there's no research about this, but I suspect that there might be like some functional changes in their brains that develop as a result of that job. We know that your occupation can change your brain. And so when you think about that, and it's so often, I mean, always, I feel like daycare is treated, certainly in this country, at policy level, as like a gap stop to faulty mothers, right? That
totally. Like, well, you can't, so just send them back.
Yes, and
totally.
we're not going to give you any subsidy. We're not going to create a public system. Like you should really be doing that care. So if you wanted to send them to daycare, well, that's your choice. But the reality is that we know that human babies have always required more than one caregiver. Like that is true.
Yes.
And the people who are doing that work have skills. They have finely tuned cognitive skills that are worth paying for and are fundamental to what we need as a society. So I think that there are like familial level effects of thinking about this, but there should really be societal ones too.
And I love that because, anyone that follows me knows I have an estranged relationship with both of my parents. So they're not in my life. Mm-hmm. And one of the things, I struggle a lot with is like, okay, well, what about my village? Am I hindering my children's rearing because they don't have a grandma and a grandfather that came from me? And what I love from your book is you gave me a hard, hell no, girl. Like, there's a ton of other people that can be super as enriching and informative and supportive. One of them sitting in the room right here with me now, that, love and inspire and teach my children things. And I think that's important because there's a lot of single moms out there. There's a lot of people that lost their partner for things that are out of their control. And society would lead you to believe, like you said, well, you're failing. Well, you can't do it on your own. No, you can actually build your own customized village. It doesn't have to be the visual that we tell everybody, which is a mom and a dad and a hetero cisgender relationship. It doesn't have to be those things.
Right. I mean, in some way, the idea that it does have to be those things is also rooted in white supremacy. Like it is, like Black culture in early America, enslaved people knew that they didn't have those intact families, so they made them, and they raised each other's children, and that was real from the start in this country for Black people. And so it is, and it is the idea that the nuclear family has done so much harm across our society. Like that, we think of it as like this, it is treated as this fundamental building block, and it is actually like very clearly in my mind a tool for control.
Yeah, it's divisive.
It is.
It's super divisive.
It keeps you isolated.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you feel like, I also, this book made me think a lot about like, well, who is that village around me? And in some ways, my husband and I have like worked hard to find that, but it's also really hard to do. Like it is.
It's full-time job.
Yeah.
Honestly. You're constantly calibrating, because too, I'm realizing as I've been doing a lot of therapy as a way to work through my PMAD, and just really to come into who I am, is the dynamics of relationships. And that are happening, and they're constantly changing and evolving, right? They're constantly changing and evolving, and I think we're constantly in places where even if you find the people, you might evolve into different places, and that's why it's never ending. To your point, like it's never ending. That's why it's kind of nice if you happen to have grandparents, because in theory they're never going to leave. So it kind of makes you feel like safer or more stabilized. But you're right, it never ends, and it's so much work.
And the cultural expectation over what it means to, like, who gets to care for your kids or who will you let in. It's just, I don't know. It's heavy.
It's heavy. Speaking of heavy, I want to kind of lead us into our last conversation point, which is PMADs. And, I would consider myself a PMAD survivor. I mean, I'm kind of in the throes of it now with my second child. I think the average stat is 1 out of 5 birthing people are likely to have a PMAD. People I talked to the founder of the Motherhood Center. Anybody that works with mothers would say it's way higher than that. Probably 1 in 3, maybe 1 in 2. The facts and the education would lead me to believe it's probably almost everybody. Like how deep you're in it, like a spectrum, depends. But I really, really loved how you peeled this conversation apart in the book, and really walked us through what PMADs are and what they aren't, and put I don't know if I want to, what's the right word I want to use for it, but really defined or differentiated postpartum depression to, which would be one stop on a spectrum, and that PMADs are a spectrum, and cover on one end would be depression, depressive symptoms, and then on the other side of the spectrum would be anxious or anxiety or higher vibrational issues. And really kind of pull that apart for people where, unless you're doing this work like us every day, you're not even aware that they're the same, or that postpartum depression's on here, or that you may have postpartum depression, and then you might be sliding across that. Which I just want to dive into that.
Yeah, so I would even like add one more layer to that, which is that folks talk about postpartum depression as one thing, and it's not one thing. It is, one researcher I talked with called it a garbage bag term, kind of like cancer. Like cancer is hundreds of things potentially. Like it is, postpartum depression is we describe as a set of symptoms, but those symptoms can come on very differently from person to person on a different timeline. They likely have many different causes. Some of them very grounded in social support or lack of social support. Some of them very biological. A combination of those things. You can have depression and you can have anxiety. It is all very complicated, and it is also very common, as you said. One of the researchers I talked to said it is very hard to study postpartum anxiety because when they give mothers screening tools, almost everybody endorses anxiety symptoms. So how do you create a control group when everyone is experiencing?
It's like kind of part of
anxiety.
that motherhood transformation you're going through. It's nerve-wracking to be responsible for another person's life, basically.
So I when I was screened for postpartum depression, I remember very clearly my OBGYN looking at my form, and I was sitting there like thinking, like, do I say something to her? Like, do I tell her I'm having a hard time? And she's looking at my screener, and she says, oh, well, some of these numbers are high, but you're in the normal range. And she said, do you have any thoughts of harming yourself or your child? And I said, no, and we moved on. Like, that's it. But I was like,
you're like, maybe, but I don't even know if I want to like say that right here. Like, are you going to judge me?
I mean, is that the only bar?
And is that the only bar?
As long as I'm not going to kill myself or hurt my child, like that's health.
Exactly.
And which is not against her. That's just where the standard of care is.
It's like the system. It's the testing that they have.
Right. So I think that if I had been screened with like a more specific anxiety tool, that maybe it would have shown up, but I might have had clinical anxiety. But even if I didn't, I just think understanding the turmoil of new parenthood and that it is normative, like it is a normal part of the process. That can go wrong, right? Like that turmoil is inherent to new parenthood. And yes, we need to like know the symptoms, have the support. We need to do a way better job screening parents and providing them with the help that they need before they're in crisis.
100%.
But also, for me, it was really powerful to know that like some bit of what I was going through was actually like this adaptive process.
Which is powerful because I think there's so much internal shame.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Because, for everyone that doesn't have this definition, guilt is where I did something bad. Shame is where I am bad.
Right.
And so there's this whole notion of if you get the stamp of postpartum depression, that it's one, like a determination.
You're a bad mother.
You're a bad mom.
Yeah.
What's wrong? Right. But really, first of all, it's treatable.
Yeah.
It's very treatable.
Yes.
And two, I mean, just from reading your book and being educated on it even deeper, it's almost kind of like, I don't know how you avoid it. Who are these crazy warrior champions that like somehow had all the things going well?
Right.
All of these different variables like came together for one and you didn't experience it. That's more like less normal.
Absolutely. So,
versus the other.
I mean, there's one this woman named Molly Dickens, who's a stress physiologist who I interview in the book, who's become a friend. She looks at the stress systems of the body and how all of them are like pushed to the absolute max, like way beyond what you experience at any other point in your life, to degrees that would be considered distinctly pathological in any other context. And she says, like, it is a fucking miracle that anyone gets through without a PMAD. Like, it is not, it doesn't make sense.
Totally.
It is amazing that that's how our biology works. I thought a lot about PMADs as I was starting this book. I very distinctly did not want it to be a book about postpartum depression, partly because I wanted it to kind of be more foundational than that, and there are other books about postpartum depression. I was very worried that talking about these broader changes in the brain might somehow carry this message that, like,
postpartum depression isn't real. Like, your brain's just changing.
Exactly, your brain's just changing. It happens to everyone, so suck it up, essentially. And I really thought about that a lot. And what I came to was that, like, my goal actually was to say, first of all, it's very real, and here's all the science, but also it is normal to need support in the perinatal period.
Say that one more time for people in the nosebleed seats.
It is 100% normal to need support. Every person, even if you have the most perfect pregnancy and all of the support and the you luck out in your biology too, like you need help. You can't do it alone. So I hope that can help. So reduce the stigma more, but also ultimately that is where we need to start from in terms of shaping our clinical care and our social policies, and so that it benefits everyone, and especially those people who have the hardest time.
Yeah, and like what you said in the book, or someone you quoted in your book, which was like, the whole thing I think I take away from your book, your work, my work, is helping people to make a clear plan. Like, knowing the information is critical. So like in this topic, I think what's so detrimental in our society is when we talk about preparing for bringing a child in this world, we talk about a fucking baby registry. How many of these useless trinkets do you need to go buy, and are you doing a good enough job because you didn't buy the right shit? Really, what we should be throwing at people's head is, you're gonna need support. You're gonna need support. You're gonna need support. So start preparing that. Like, who cares about the registry? You're gonna find all that shit at 7-Eleven if you need it, right? You can find it if you need it. But what you won't be able to find, like we talked about, is good support. And whether that's in your family or not, but you can be building that for 9 months.
Absolutely.
You can be putting that around yourself. You can.
Have you ever experienced depression or anxiety in your life? Then you should, even if you're feeling healthy, get a therapist lined up. Start going now, because you will need it. And even we talked about this briefly before we started, but we talk about birth plans and how we want those to go, but we don't actually talk about what happens after, how the plan affects what happens after the baby's here.
Your first initial trauma for you and the baby. I mean, whether it went well or not, coming out of a bubble where you're connected by a cord to another human and then you're not, that's intense. Even if you have the perfect birth, that's a trauma. Totally.
And there's this emerging research around childbirth-related PTSD, and there's a sense of what that pretty clear sense of what that is, and what are the factors that can cause someone to develop PTSD related to childbirth. They're not always obvious. They're not always the people who had the most complicated pregnancies or the most emergency C-section or the most near-death experience. It often is those, but it can also feel someone who had a perfectly typical birth but who felt out of control, or who felt subject to abuse by their caregivers. This is like especially around women of color. The lack of control in the process is huge, and so we're starting to know those things. We need to do something with that information. Like we should do a much better job at this point of screening people for not only the PMADs we talk about most of all, but for that too, while they're in the hospital, before they leave
and come home. Because you're right, like there's so many. One, you put a good flag in the sand in your book, which is, you know, I always stop people. Leah will tell you this, my friend that's here in the audience, our 2 audience members. Hi, hello. Is that we should never say that our situation is less painful or hard because it's not your situation. So trauma for me is an independent definition than trauma for you, than trauma for the next person. And it's critical that we empower people with that knowledge because I think people will be more likely to speak up to it. So like, for example, you talked about in your book, like, you know, having a trauma could mean, yes, I have a perfect birth, but you know, I am a person of color and I'm not, my financial situation is not meeting what it's going to take. I'm going to come home and have this baby and I can't afford it. I can't afford to take care of myself. I can't afford to take care of the baby. How freaking stressful is that? Like in itself. Or I'm going to come home and I'm not safe. And what's going to happen in those environments. And so I love what you're saying because I think this childhood birth post-traumatic stress disorder is critical. I hear women describing it all the time. I was just in New York doing a birth story event, and this woman was describing that real time and was saying, well, that's not a big deal. I said, that's not a big deal. You got, literally, she was supposed to, she wouldn't have had a C-section, but the doctors told her, well, you don't need to come in yet. So they delayed her birth to the point where she had to have it. Then they were yelling at her because she was like, I don't want it. And then they were like beating her up about it. And I was like, girl, you are a warrior. Like you did that. Like, and that was an insane situation. Like, have you processed that? And her answer, like many birthing people, is no. She's like, I'm talking about it right now.
Yeah,
that makes my heart hurt.
Yeah,
right?
Me too. And it all, I think, is related to the fact that we treat childbirth like a medical event with like a beginning and an end and a hierarchy, you know, and we don't see it as this more holistic thing where there's a lot happening beyond what you can see, and that it is part of this developmental stage, and it is a really vulnerable time. And I mean, I say that, and it also like goes back to the systems of oppression. Like, why was she being yelled at while she's in childbirth? There's no reason that should be
ever. And I know you talked a lot about that in the book, that like that's common. I had a very unique situation as a Black mother where I had an OBG that I absolutely loved. I had a horrible traumatic experience where they found tumors in my ovaries. I had a 15 centimeter tumor in one ovary, a 5 centimeter tumor in the other, and we thought before I was pregnant. Like I would have never even been able to get pregnant, but I was a millennial. I am a millennial, so you know we're on this later cusp of having children, so I didn't even realize it. But I'd become so ill. I'd been so sick in the healthcare system. Been to every doctor for 5 years. I was withering away. They were like, you know, just take fiber, like whatever, you're fine. No one cared, no one helped me, you know, like whatever. I was a number, but I found an OBG that listened and was amazing. So I had a really connective relationship with him. So it was a different experience for me in that realm. Like no one was going to talk shit to me because he was the department head and like I'm like family to him. So he had like 12 nurses circling through, but that's not the case. I'm realizing like people are being severely mistreated in this moment that is harder than any physical thing you could ever do. And that doesn't matter how the baby comes out. It's this hard thing, which is sad. Yeah, and it's really layered. So, you know, for example, like for women of color, there are these compounding factors where if they have a complicated pregnancy, they are like if they have gestational diabetes or hypertension or something, they're because of how
they're seen within the medical system, their pregnancies become pathologized, and so they become like this case to. They lose like a lot of their authority, I think, within their own decision making, and
100%.
become like a problem versus a pregnant woman deserving of care and support.
Yes.
And so many of those those healthcare disparities among Black women are related to racism and racist systems in our country. So then you have the health problems that result from that, and then once you go into pregnancy, it's their fault. Right?
Yes, exactly.
And their pregnancies become...
It's like, oh, well, Black women are more likely to have diabetes. Black women are more likely to have a heart attack. Well, actually, it's the system that fucking put you in that situation from the beginning. And now I'm in said system, trying to be treated like every other patient in here, and I can't even get the baseline, which isn't even up to par.
Yeah, and now what we're learning is that a lot of the what we're learning with data, what we probably knew previously was that a lot of the cardiac crises that happen postpartum in Black women are really the result of often things being missed or discounted, or the women themselves being dismissed when they complain of
needing help or something's feeling off. So Chelsea, this has been like such an enriching conversation. I mean, for me, the book opened my mind up to so many possibilities. And so my question to you is like, what's next? What happens here? Like, I think you had a great beginning and end of the story, but now there's all these questions that have arisen. So talk to me through like, where does your work evolve from here now?
It's a great question. I'm like continuing to just write and think and figure out what's next. I'm really interested in this issue of childbirth related PTSD. I think it's something that we don't talk about enough, and that is one of those areas where there's really like a lot of room for action.
Yes.
But also, I mean, this book has really, putting it out into the world has been an incredible experience, because I've connected with so many people like you who are like doing this work and changing the narrative, and we are part of this movement to like change clinical care and develop the social policy. I really feel like part of the work is doing this.
Yes.
Like just talking about things differently, and like saying what our actual experiences are, and sharing that, and helping people to understand what it means to become a parent and what we can do with it.
I love that. Everybody, I have to give you a hug on the phone. This was so amazing.
Really? Thanks for this. I'm so grateful for what you're doing in the world. I mean, it's really such important work.
Oh, I mean, honestly, it's just been so empowering, because I have 2 little girls, and the biggest thing for me is I have to do some work. We have to do some work to make sure that they really want to be moms. Like, my daughter talks to me now about how she's going to set up her doula and her birth, because she wants me to be there. She's like, Mommy, because I show her the work I'm doing. I'm talking with these doulas, and she says, well, Mommy, I want to have you there.
Maternal brain,
right? I'm like, let's do it. I'll be there. And I want them to be able to have this space where like they can have the motherhood that they want and be the amazing individuals that I know is within them. And we can't do that unless we do these types of conversations. So thank you so much, Chelsea. If you haven't already, y'all, get the book. Please read the book. This is life-changing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.